Well, the time has arrived. So greetings from Grapevine, Texas. This is Mitch with 30 West IP, and we're here with the June 2019 Hot Topic Webcast. And we're going to talk today about changes that are approaching for the SAFA inspection program used in primarily in Europe, and about R&P requirements at Nice, France. And we're going to try to make this a more collaborative exercise than we've done in the past. We're going to poll those of you who have attended to try to get a feel for what percentage of our operators are being inspected and what some of the topics are. And we think that that'll help you because you can see how we as a community are participating and supporting that program. So there's going to be two parts to this, a little bit different approach than we've done in the past. And I want to remind you, as always, we're recording the webcast, and the webcast will be available online after it's edited. If you go to our website, 30westip.com, there's a link to take you to a YouTube channel that we use to place our webinars and our webcast on after they're done. So let me just start by thanking you all for being here. And I want to do a little introduction about the panel and about how the panel is used. This is the control panel over here on the left, and the control panel is used by you to be able to select different things. The orange button up here at the top will allow you to collapse it, and it'll give you a little bit more real estate if you're operating on a small screen. Let's see. You can choose to use either the computer audio or a telephone for access. But if you're using a phone, you want to select your computer off to avoid feedback if it's at all possible. Down here in the bottom of the control panel, we have 5 handouts. And during the course of the presentation, when we're discussing one of these topics, I'll alert you that which of these handouts we're discussing. But they're most of them are PDFs with the exception of Annex 6, which is a Word doc, and they can be downloaded very easily onto your computer. You will be muted. Last webcast was the first of this nature where we had somebody assisting us and we were using a different software platform. And this time we're using the same platform. So if you'd like to, you can type in questions and the questions will be presented. There's a box where you can uncage the questions by selecting this little button right here, and it gives you a little bit more room, and you can type in and send your questions to us. And I'm here with Harry Driscoll, and I'm going to let Harry Driscoll introduce himself. Harry, you want to say a few words?
Sure. Thank you, Mitch, for letting me participate. I look forward to learning a lot from you, as I always do. And I'm going to be available to help read off the questions as they come in. So I certainly want to encourage the participants to ponder their questions and go ahead and write them up and send them in as soon as they occur to them, and we'll organize them and make them known to Mitch and the rest in the group, and hopefully we'll cover all the subjects very thoroughly. Thanks, Mitch.
Thank you, Harry. Last time we had Karina with us, and Karina was a producer from the Webcast company, and she did a great job, but she wasn't as familiar with the topics. And Harry has a consulting group that does assistance with LOAs and op specs, so he's very familiar with the subject. He's a friend of mine. He's down in Houston. He couldn't be here in Dallas today. Terry is also available. And Terry Geisen is my partner at 30 West IP, and many of you probably remember her from Air Training International. And she's going to help with tech questions if somebody's having connectivity issues or something like that. Then if you type in a question and tell her how to contact you, she can assist you with that as well. So having completed kind of the housekeeping, if you will, what we'll do is we'll progress to the actual topic itself. I'm going to begin by talking about historical SAFA data, because this is going to really enlighten us as to what the program's doing and where we fit in it, because there's information. In fact, Harry helped me access some of this information that can really tell us a lot about what they do. Here is a list that I extracted from the report, and the report shows the results of how many SAFA inspections were conducted from 2013 to 2017. This is the most recent printout, and I took the community of us, so the business aviation operators, and I elected to kind of break out our aircraft, and you can see a couple of trends here. There are aircraft like the Global Express and the Gulfstream 550 who get more inspections than some of the other aircraft. And I think that can be accounted for just simply by the fact that there's a large fleet of those aircraft and they do more international operations. I'm not sure that I would try to speculate and say that they get more inspections. I would just say that there's probably more of those aircraft doing these types of operations. But you can see across the board that like the 7X is getting a fraction of that, and I'm not entirely sure why, but we'll leave that to, perhaps a little bit different time. Another thing I want to point out that this tells us is that there's a definitive trend towards increasing inspections. With some notable exceptions, most of these numbers are getting larger and larger as these inspections expand. And that's what Harry and I want to do, is we want to kind of get a feel for how this is affecting you and if you as an operator are seeing this. I'm going to extract information, and this information is going to come from, in some part, flight deck findings, and in some part, cabin findings. They break their findings out into flight deck, cabin, and exterior. And exterior didn't provide us a lot of insights. There wasn't a consistent application of exterior errors that were very enlightening. So we're just going to look briefly at the flight deck and the cabin. And in the flight deck, at the graph at the top, Alpha 2-3, you see it is significantly more frequently shown, and the different colors show different years. So we're going to kind of break out some of these things. And Alpha 2-3 on the flight deck is really what we would refer to as a logbook. Are you writing things up in the logbook, and are they able to be identified by an inspector? And when they find a deficiency here, it's because they found something that was not able to meet a standard but was not already listed in the logbook. Had you written it up in the logbook correctly and they identified it, it wouldn't be added to a finding. It's only a finding if they hadn't already listed it in the logbook. And that, by far and away, for the flight deck, is one of the largest items that they have a problem with. The second one, and actually it's the third one, Alpha 01 is general condition, and it actually doesn't reach the same levels as Alpha 04. And general condition is so broad, it covers a host of things. But under Alpha 04, they talk about, are your manuals up to date? Is your MEL up to date? Do you have the proper international general operations manual, international operations manual? Does it identify things like flight duty time? And the final one I want to point out is flight preparation. And flight preparation is how does your flight plan conform to your equipage and your authorizations? We talk a lot about that in training. If you have a filing code, is it supported by an LOA or an op spec? Have you got the fuel performance planning that meets the requirements for ICAO? Do you have the proper weather, the proper NOTAMs? And this is an area that we're going to discuss in some depth, quite honestly, just a little bit later, because at the last IOC meeting, Laurent Chapeau, the CAA authority for the French SAFA program, identified that this was an area that was going to be an emphasis item. So we're going to target that. We got some feedback by email by some of the operators, and at various points I'm going to read you from that where it's relevant. So here's some feedback from an operator. They were in Madrid and they were fueling, and 3 inspectors from the Spanish authority came up, and they were SAFA inspectors, and it was an N-numbered registered airplane. And one was a operations inspector, one was a maintenance inspector, and the third was in training. And typically it's 2 inspectors, not 3, but they had somebody in training, and they were conducting a ferry flight without passengers from Madrid to Keflavik and then to Bangor, and they were checked for all of their paperwork. All of the items that we're talking about here in flight preparation were of great interest to them. They inspected other things as well, but in their email, they talked about how after they completed this check, they weren't concerned about the leg from Kef to Bangor and the Bangor leg to home. They were only concerned about the one that was within the European airspace. And they went item by item through the checklist and looked at everything that was part of their 53 items, and they covered it very in depth. They did ask them about their currency in the airplane and if they could demonstrate it, and they demonstrated it via images on the phone. They had photographs on the phone of their completion documents, and they were satisfied with that. And he said they were very polite. This inspection took 60 minutes, and they provided them the paperwork so that if they were stopped in Kef, they could show that in Kef that they had previously been inspected. His comment was that it wasn't a big deal. He had the proper paperwork, he had the proper documents, and they didn't have passengers. So they felt like this was a pretty fair inspection. And I'm looking forward to perhaps hearing a little bit more about the experience of some of the others here as we go through this. But an hour is a little longer than experience seems to dictate. Most folks talk about them taking about 35 or 45 minutes. Now, when we get to cabin findings, we can see that Bravo 01 is way out in front. It is the largest single finding of any of the findings that we see within this particular 5-year period. And that has to do with the general condition of the interior of the cabin itself. And they look at the condition of the cabin, the condition of the carpeting, crew duties, improperly stowed luggage, improperly stowed catering equipment, and things of that nature. And we've heard stories anecdotally from crews about them not liking runners being down or extra carpet being on top of carpet. We talk about that in training. But what we see here is the area where obviously they're paying a whole lot of attention, the single largest finding. I have another email from an operator, another November number airplane. In this case, it's a large cabin Gulfstream. And he says one of our aircraft had a recent SAFA violation for having an aft conference bed berthed for landing. SAFA sent this finding to the FAA, and the FAA instructed them that they had to comply with it and had to respond to it. We talk about that in training as well. How do you respond to these things? Technically, we must have always been in violation because most of the conference groups are placarded to be in the full upright position for takeoff and landing, but it had never been enforced and it was not a practice with their organization. So there's another example where it didn't stop them from flying, but it was a deficiency. And when a deficiency reaches a certain level, it has to be responded to by the crew, or by the operator, I should say. And the way that they do that is they send that to the FAA, and the FAA will forward it to the FSDO, who will then ask the organization to respond. Access to emergency exits. Now, every time that Laurent Chapeau comes to the IOC, he's done this twice in the last 4 years, he's talked about this, and he's talked about their concerns about this, and having the emergency exits blocked by luggage and by various stuff that's stowed in the seats and strapped down. And they have a lot of concerns about that, and it's pretty understandable. And I think we as a GA group are probably a little more frequently in a position where this might happen. I would suggest this. Although we don't have a lot of control over a lot of things in our execution of a trip, you don't have to open the door and let anybody in until you've done a walk through the back of the airplane. So if you look out the window and you see 4 or 5 guys and you suspect that's a little bit more than just the handler, you might want to walk back and ensure that that area is free and clear before you open the cabin door and have an inspector come on board. Emergency exit lighting and torches being flashlights, is another area. It's not nearly as big as the previous, but it's a consistent area where they want to look. So you can see the emergency exits, either the lighting and or the access, or both areas together, where they have a lot of interest and they have identified that is a consistent concern. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to see what the real deal is. I'd like to see what it is that you experience and what your findings are. So if you'll bear with us, what I want to begin with is a discussion about your experience. Have you or your department experienced a SAFA inspection in the last 2 years? So approximately the last 2 years. Okay, I think we stabilized here. Harry, if you can do some math for me. Okay,
they got
about
half the group has responded, and it's about a 60-40.
143 people. Yeah.
We're about 70% have voted, and 60% no, 40% yes so far.
Okay, and that's in the last 2 years. And I think this is useful to all of us. The reason Harry and I wanted to do this is that there's a lot of urban myths about what goes on, and this should help. So we've got the data, and I'm publishing it so you can see this. We have 80% participation in a group of 142. So that would be, that's quite a large number of respondents, and I'll do the math on that later. But 40% yes, that they have had an inspection in the last 2 years. So let me move to the next question. Have you or your department experienced a SAFA check in approximately the last 5 years? Harry, can you write these numbers down?
Sure.
I think the software will collect them, but I've been wrong about a lot of things involving software.
No problem. I'm watching it build now, Mitch, and we're right around 55 yes, 45 no.
So it seems to be almost consistent.
Yeah, it's almost, well, it does very close, very close.
Okay.
So we got 79%, 80% now, which is about 113 people. Yeah.
Close the poll. Now you can see the results of that: 56% yes, 44% no. And let's move on. And here's, if you answered yes to the last 5 years. So if you've answered yes to the last 5 years, was there a finding? Do you recall, was there a finding? So if you didn't answer yes, if you're in that group of the folks that didn't answer yes, don't answer this. The size of the group right now is 144 attendees. So we have a question about that. Go ahead and launch that poll. That was scary. Looked like they had a whole lot of people that had a finding in the first go.
About a third.
Now, when they don't have a finding, and I'm not sure that there are variations on this, but they should still give you the paperwork, and it should still say on it that the inspection had been conducted, and they would note NIL. That's the correct way according to their process for them to note that. Nil. Findings would be nil. So we're getting a smaller percentage of this vote now. That makes perfect sense. With about 40% of the folks voting, we have about 40 that said yes, there was a finding. So I'm going to share that so you guys can see that. So that would be 40, about 56 people with 38 showing a finding. Okay. If you were inspected in the last 5 years, was the MEL inspected? And this is a topic. Everything has gone quiet since the 2-year vote. Okay, I'm going to close that poll and share the results. 64 said yes. 64% of 32% said yes. So excellent. That is very, very informative, because it tells us that they really are looking at that. And now I've got a couple of really short questions, and I won't spend as much time with them, but I want to present them. Have you ever been required to demonstrate training currency? We did see that with the crew in Madrid in the example that we showed. And this is a question that comes up at the IOC every year about training currency. And the way that Laurent responded to this is that actually it's one of the few instances where the state of registry gets to determine if you're current or not. And that has, I think, in large part due to there are a lot of states with very remote, locations, places in Africa, places in the Far East where they don't have training centers very close, and they leave it to the state to determine currency. So here we're saying 28% yes out of 33, and 33, 34 is about what we saw last time, the percentage of voting. Still moving up. So let me show you the results of that. So that does happen. That is something that is out there. And very briefly, we've got two more left. Have you ever been delayed when you had passengers on board due to a SAFA check? We did have an email from an operator, and he did note that he operated out of Le Bourget quite frequently. And for a period of about 12 months, he was consistently inspected, had a very, very bad experience, and had experienced delays on multiple occasions on departure with passengers. And he wrote that he contacted the FAA in Washington, D.C., and informed them of the problems. And the FAA actually intervened, and he hasn't had a SAFA check in Le Bourget since. Apparently and I know the gentleman, he's a real professional. He had several very bad experiences, but upon appealing to the FAA, they seem to be able to resolve it. So here we see 99% have not been delayed with 47% voting. That's a really strong number. And obviously it happens. Anecdotally, we have a client who here is showing that has in fact happened to him. And then one more question. Have you ever experienced a SAFA inspection between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. local? And what I'm asking with this is simply trying to answer questions that I get a lot. Do they do this in the middle of the night when you're, operating in and out of an airport? It would seem to be odd, but your feedback would be very helpful with this. So this is a bit akin to the delay. It apparently does happen, but it doesn't happen with any frequency or consistency. So, all right, I'm going to share that poll. That's it for the questions, and I hope that wasn't too inconvenient, because that it's extremely difficult for us in the industry that I'm in as an instructor, and Harry as a consultant, to get a really solid feel on how these things proceed. But that data, the data that you guys just shared, is really, really quite helpful. And I think it's helpful to you. I hope it's helpful to you as well in this process. So we're going to proceed out of the questions at this point. This is a document that is the inspection instructions for the SAFA inspector. And these have existed for years, but I'm showing you this one because this is a new one. And this will go into effect on 1 September 2019. So this should be guiding a few changes and a few different things that we hadn't seen in the past. So you can look forward to these types of things occurring within, next 6 weeks. This is a ramp inspection manual, and the ramp inspection manual is also being published effective 1 September 2019. It's got some great stuff in it. This really gives us a lot of insight into what their actions should be as they conduct these items. And it really, I know this isn't going to sound like a good read, but we get a million questions about SAFA checks. And in here, I'm going to pull out a few things that are very helpful. And this is also one of the handouts that's in the handout sheet. So this is going to go into effect 1 September. These are the 48 states currently participating in the inspection process. They're all European states, Eastern, Western European states, with the exception of Australia, Canada, Singapore, and United Arab Emirates. This list gets longer. The last time we talked about SAFA, Australia was not a member. I don't know of anybody that's had a SAFA check in Canada, but I suspect we could, because it has now been a couple of years that they've been part of that program. Now, the inspection instructions here talk about the standard in which they use to judge the inspection. And again, we talk about this in training. This is an attempt to make the standards the same across the SAFA field, whether you're in Canada, Australia, or whether you're in Europe. And they use Annex 1.
Mitch, can I interrupt you just for a moment? We've got one
Yes.
comment that they're not seeing what is being talked about, that they're still seeing the SAFA inspection question.
Okay, I think I resolved that. If we can go back down and somebody can confirm, I did see that was a problem.
Okay, sorry to interrupt.
Can somebody confirm that you actually can see the categories?
Tony was having the difficulty. I don't know if it's gotten resolved.
Okay, thank you. And so Annex 1 out of ICAO, Annex 2 out of ICAO, Annex 6 Part 1, Annex 8, and Annex 8 is largely maintenance, and some additional annexes. But what we're seeing here is they're not inspecting you against a French standard. They're not inspecting you against a Greek or a UK standard. They're inspecting you against a common ICAO standard. I was concerned because I was under the understanding that when they issued this new guidance that they were going to include Annex 6 Part 2, because Annex 6 Part 1 is for commercial operators and Annex 6 Part 2 is for general aviation operators, and that's the preponderance of who we work with here. But before we move into that and the results of my inquiry with them about that, there's some additional things that can occur. And I had an email from an operator, and he said that there's no doubt a large number of U.S. registered or participants in the webinar that would be going to the World Economic Forum in Davos in January. This happens annually. And he said that many of those operators would relocate and park at Dubendorf Air Base in Switzerland for their destination airport. Dubendorf constitutes nearly all of that company's SAFA inspections, and he's suggesting that every aircraft every year receives an inspection as they relocate to this Air Force base in Switzerland. And there's a package that they get sent as they prepare to go that is 47 pages this year, and it tells them what their expectations are when they arrive at the Air Force Base, what kind of documentation they have to have, if they have unique approaches, and there are some unique items they have to have available in the cockpit. And he goes on to state that this goes way beyond just SAFA. This is some operational procedures, and when they get checked, it's always a very thorough SAFA inspection, and it goes beyond Annex 1, 2, 6, and 8, and includes the specifics for that Air Force base. So there are exceptions to many things, but for those of us who've been in the military, if you operate in and out of military bases, they really want to ensure that you're able to do that and do that safely. So that's an exception, but it's a notable one, and it has come up at IOC before, as we've talked about that. Now back to the discussion of Annex 6 Part 1, as opposed to Annex 6 Part 2. The guidance in the manual said they were using Annex 6 Part 1, so I wrote Laurent Chapeau email, and I said, aren't the new inspection instructions for commercial flights only? We really had been led to believe that would be rectified, and would we be evaluated on commercial standards? And he said, no, we would not be evaluated on commercial standards, and that they were working to redefine their documentation for non-commercial operators. And ultimately, I've had this conversation with him in person. I did want to get it in writing so I could share it on the webcast. But if you get a write-up and you have an issue that you don't believe is correct, like they write you up against a commercial standard when you're a general aviation operator, that inspection gets reviewed by an administrator before it gets sent to the FAA, and it should be eliminated by the inspector that reviews it. But if it's not, and it goes to the FAA, you can rebut it. You can send them back and say, okay, Annex 6 Part 2 says this, and I'm a general aviation operator. That can be your response. Can you speak? I have a question here from a guy that I know. Can you speak to alcohol testing with SAFA? I'm going to get to that. I'm going to do that. Harry, could you help me out with it? Do we have a bunch of questions or just a few?
We probably got about 6 or 7. Did you want to wait until the question answer time, or you want to address them as you go?
Um, I tell you what, let me go just a little bit further and then we'll address some of these questions. So you can take a
Okay.
look at them, Harry, and then I'll take some here in just a moment. Uh,
Okay.
Here's the Annex 6 Part 2, and there is rarely any confusion, but on occasion somebody will call us up and they'll get worried about, having to meet some standard, and they're quoting Annex 6 Part 1, which is commercial. If you're a general aviation operator, this dictates what we do. We're going to talk about fuel requirements, and we'll finish fuel requirements, then take a few questions. In the front of Annex 6 Part 2, it mentions that fuel would be available at an alternate with a reserve of 45 minutes at normal cruising altitude. This statement is for general aviation, but it is different in Section 3. Section 3 of that manual addresses the operation of large and turbojet airplanes over 12,500 pounds. And this section identifies an entire page of pre-flight calculation for usable fuel. And I will be honest, we never used these standards in my experience when I was flying. And Laurent brought this up as an emphasis item at IOC this year. So what you see here is the document and the essentials, and I created a handout for that so that you can download it and review that. And I'm going to talk about it in a little bit of depth. Here's a flight plan header for a flight from Teterboro to Le Bourget in a Gulfstream 450. So I did something that I was familiar with. This is not something that would have been odd for us at all. And we've created a format in this particular layout that would satisfy the requirements of Annex 6 Part 2. We worked with AirLink Direct. AirLink Direct set up this format. It's a 0 Lima, if you care. I actually submitted it to Laurent for review. Laurent said he would kind of give it a look at and give us an approval or not. We did not get a response from him, and it has been about 8 weeks, so I'm not sure they're going to. They said they were willing to, but I don't think they wanted to put it on the line. Let's start with trip fuel. Define trip fuel. Trip fuel is the amount of fuel required to enable the aircraft from takeoff until landing. So it's pretty straightforward. When we're using AirLink Direct, the trip fuel is the actual fuel burned, or the planned fuel burned for that trip. Operating conditions for the flight for a trip wouldn't have to be reflective of appropriate weather reports and forecasts. Perhaps initially there was an altitude that you couldn't use because of severe turbulence, anticipated delays, whether there was some delay program associated with the airport, or possible configuration deviations. If you are restricted by a configuration deviation to a certain altitude, your flight plan should reflect that altitude. So that's trip fuel. Now, the alternate fuel is basically going to talk about using an expected cruising altitude. And, for generations, we would get alternates and they'd be direct to some alternate with a parabolic arc. And that's not realistic and that's not acceptable. And they want you to have an expected routing. And we've talked about this a lot. They don't want direct, they want a route. If there's SIDS and stars, they'd like to see SIDS and stars used. We've rebutted that with Laurent and suggested, there's certainly airports that don't have SIDS and stars, and often the flight planning engine will support that. But that's the verbiage out of alternate fuel. Taxi fuel, as you would imagine, is the fuel to taxi, but you also have to have APU burn in there. And then contingency fuel. And this is one that's relatively new. That's the amount of fuel that would compensate for unforeseen factors. And it's not to be less than 5%. So we never use this. And the question comes up immediately in my mind, well, is this going to be onerous? So we'll take a look at that and see if that hurts us. Fuel to compensate for unforeseen factors. When this is filed, if you were to go up and pull 0 Lima up and file it, you would need to put 5% in to get this to say 5%. We had AirLink Direct put the 5% up here like that, but it doesn't default to it. You have to actually select it in the system if you want it to reflect 5%. Now, the final reserve at 1,500 feet. Again, we ask AirLink Direct to put final reserve at 1,500 feet. It does do it at 1,500 feet. In this case, for a turbine engine airplane, it would be 30 minutes. Now, we traditionally put 45 minutes of holding in, but they want 30. And quite honestly, the 30 plus the contingency doesn't end up being too onerous at all. It's not a problem. In this format, 30 minutes must also be selected. It won't default to 30 minutes. We put the 5% and the 1500 on the left in order to make it easier during a SAFA inspection to answer that question if somebody asks it. Additional fuel. Now, additional fuel is something that I've never really thought about, but it's the amount of additional fuel that I would have to land with if I were to have a transoceanic flight that had ETPs, something to deal with an engine failure, loss of pressurization, the most critical point. Our experience at running these was it was consistently loss of pressurization, so we put additional depress and engine in op here. And in this instance, that trip only required an additional 350 pounds to meet that. There are exceptions to that. It would be important to note that, that would be zero on a domestic route where ETPs aren't used. So let's take a look at the final product. The required fuel for that flight in the 450 going to Le Bourget, it wouldn't even be a full bag of gas. That wasn't even a full tank. And that would have this 450 landing with 4,428 pounds. That's not unrealistic in the least, particularly for an oceanic crossing. So I don't believe that having these standards incorporated into your operation is going to be onerous. And if you're not really liking the Zero Lima format, but you want to use that fuel format, or perhaps you have a different flight plan provider, Jepson, Universal, ITPS, you can use that format, and you can show them that format and say, I want to emulate this. And that is what the expectation is of the SAFA folks. Now, we talked a little bit about alternates. In the Zero Lima format, in the flight plan run, up at the top is Le Bourget. Well, after Le Bourget is the alternate route. And that's something else they like to see in the flight planning model. Not just direct, but an alternate route with various details. And again, to go back to the alternate route, they want to see a realistic cruising altitude and routing. And in this section up in the top right, what we see is a summary of that flight level 160. They got missed approach fuel in there. We've got a SID and a star in there. So this would perfectly be tailored to meet that expectation. But again, you can't always have SIDs and stars. That's not always possible, but that's something that they do like to talk about. In the past, when they've written up that somebody didn't have SIDs and stars, it wasn't something that required a response. There was an observation, and it was minor, and it did not require them to respond back, to our knowledge, from the experience and the feedback that we've had. I'm going to return to the presentation, and there had been a question about alcohol, and this article actually discusses that. And I'm going to show you the facts behind it. But this is an article from the NBAA, and it talks about testing for alcohol consumption during ramp inspections and how it's already being done in the Netherlands, Germany, Japan, and Singapore at a minimum. EASA regulations that take in effect August 2020 require countries to begin drug testing for alcohol for flight and cabin crews in conjunction with SAFA checks. I want to be careful about the wording there. It doesn't require them to check everybody. It says they may check. There is no requirement that everybody be checked for alcohol, but it says that they may be checked, and we'll see that here in just a moment. It goes on in this article to say that some countries have a zero tolerance and local law may supersede the 0.02 gram threshold. I have a hard time with that. SAFA is all about using ICAO standards, and ICAO standards would be in the application of SAFA. So if someone were to use their local standard, that really couldn't be part of a SAFA sanctioned program, in my opinion, because they're not supposed to use local rules during that inspection. I did take a snapshot of this to kind of give a little bit of insight because I did some research. Apparently the Japanese and the Indians have got a lot of problems with this alcohol thing. And I obviously there's problems with pilots and alcohol, but in the US, I think it's a little bit more remote, at least from my experience. The numbers that were in these articles were shocking as I read through this, and I think they were a little bit inconsistent with my experience in this industry. But there is some motivation here because of things like that. Within the ramp inspection manual, I'm going to just extract a few of the details that talk about this. An alcohol test may be carried out at any time during a ramp inspection. That's may, that's not must. The inspector should ensure that the testing environment is discreet. Nobody should be giving you a breathalyzer test on the ramp where you can be seen. It should be done in an environment that is not, in the public eye. If there is a problem, they will give written information about a positive confirmation to the pilot or the crew member, and they will then retest within 15 to 30 minutes. So there's the basics. That's the actual standards that are associated with it. When we get to the section later where they talk about this in a little bit more detail, it says that the BAC level should not exceed the level equivalent of 0.2 grams per liter of blood. But it does say right there, or the lower of the national statutory limits. So I guess they've provided for that within that inspection. So that does make us subject to the local rules. In their new form, as part of their new process, the ramp inspection form actually puts right at the top in the header a question: was an alcohol test conducted, and was it conducted for 1 or 2 flight crew members, or however many cabin crew members that there are. Now, I want to speak for just a moment about the R&P approach requirements for Nice, France. This has come up as a topic, and I had an email from an operator. I've had several emails from operators, but this was part of the preparation for this. He said that he recently attended a recurrent class for a Gulfstream 650, and they had a discussion in class about the requirements for R&P approval for operating into Nice, France. And he said there was no consensus in the class whatsoever. Everybody had a different opinion about how it's done. And he said he was sure that the SAFA folks would be checking the flight plan data blocks, and that he would like to see it addressed. And that's part of the reason that we're doing this. So let me go ahead and give you the details. I'm going to show you what the documents say. I have talked to a couple of people who have operated in and out here recently, and their experience is completely consistent with what we're going to show you right now. So there was, within that group in the 650 recurrent, no consensus about this whatsoever. This is the Aeronautical Information Circular from France that deals with the subject of R&P approach requirements that went into effect in March in Nice. These type of documents supplement the AIP. I talk about the AIP a lot. These type of supplement the AIP. It says that at a minimum that we should have approaches in the database of the airplane for the RNAV Alpha for runway 4 and the RNAV Delta for runway 22. That's a minimum. They'd like to have more, and they mentioned that in here. Those approaches, or this document, the AIC I'm showing you, is part of the handouts that we've got prepared for this. And here you see the approaches themselves. So the approaches on the right, you see the runway 22, and on the left you see runway 4, runway RNAV Alpha, and these are the two that you must have as a minimum. There are, for runway 4 left, LPV approaches and LNAV VNAV approaches, and for 4 right there are LPV approaches and LNAV VNAV approaches. So let's look a little farther into the document that I just showed you, the header for the AIC. And it says, and this was in the email, that starting on the 1st of March of this year, R&P approach capability must be included in all IFR flight plans to Nice Airport using S1 or S2 in field number 18. And that would be your capability to do an R&P approach. S2 is what most of us put in there because we can do Baro VNAV approaches. Or, it says, or item B in 10A, and that would indicate that you have LPV capability. So that's what they're looking for. They're also looking for you to have in the database the approaches that we just identified. Now, this is an FAA handout that gives you the decoding of those codes. And I just want to point out, for approach, S1 would be RMP approach and S2 would be RMP approach with Baro VNAV. Those do not require an LOA. They use RMP approach as a term because that is ICAO's intent. The FAA traditionally calls them RNAV approaches. We're going to explore that a little bit more. On the flip side of that decoding strip, they show B as LPV. The Europeans and the ICAO community calls that APV. That's basically SBAS. And so if you have SBAS, you're good. If you can do a Baro VNAV approach and file S2, you're good. Most of us have both, and they would show, as we see here in red, in 10A or in item 18. The question now is, I want to make very clear what the French expectations are. I went through the AIP, I went through the AICs. This is the AIC that originally implemented RMP approaches in Europe back in 2012, and it's reflected in the AIP today. And what it states is that if you're a general aviation operator, and it goes in and talks about French operators first, then it says other pilots, and other pilots would be us, foreign pilots, that to perform an RNAV GNSS approach, the aircraft and its crew should have the agreement of the authority which issued the license. This does not require an LOA. If the FAA says you can do LPV approaches, then you can do LPV approaches in France. They're expecting that the FAA would require you to be trained and your airplane properly equipped. In this 2012 document, they use the term RNAV GNSS. So let's go ahead and kind of look at that. This is also in your handout, but one of the things that's really making this confusing is nomenclature. And ICAO published a circular, and it talked about RNAV and RMP approach chart depictions. And in the very body of it, it states that there is a naming convention that is not standardized throughout the world. And it makes this very confusing. And this is, I think, systemically the issue that we'd like to resolve. They've stated in this ICAO document that on 1 December 2022, that the RNP title would be used in lieu of the RNAV. Because when we do an RNAV approach, we have monitoring alerting. That's a requirement for RNAV approaches. So they're not really RNAV approaches. That's just a term from another era. And they're saying that the final naming convention will simply be RNP runway 23. And then if you had to have an authorization, it would be RNP runway 23 AR. And anytime you see AR, that would require an LOA, but it wouldn't require an LOA if it did not say AR. This is 30 May 2019 AIC from France, and it talks about their transition to the ICAO standard in the naming convention of approaches. And within it, I'm not going to get into great detail, they're going to adopt the RMP nomenclature that we saw in that circular. But this is the FAA and their response. The FAA addresses the names, and it states that the FAA will retain RNAV GNSS or RNAV GPS to avoid spending money to retitle thousands of approach plates. Now, personally, I wish they had conformed, but they didn't give me any calls and ask my opinion. But we're not the only ones. I was able, this is in a handout, I was able to run down the French circular, or the, not the French, but the Canadian circular, and the Canadians will also retain RNAV GNSS very much like we will, for very similar reasons. So that's a little bit about operating in out of Nice. I didn't just take my read of it. I did talk to some folks, and I talked to a SME at Honeywell, who does their work for them with interacting with the FAA, and he had come to all of those the same conclusions I'm sharing with you in his research, and was of the belief that there was no intent to lock out somebody due to the fact they didn't have an LPV LOA. Now, that concludes the body of the discussion. And I try to keep this under an hour, so obviously I kind of got it right here under the nose. We appreciate your attendance. I appreciate you being patient with us as we ask all these questions, because the questions have been very helpful to me. Harry has been very helpful to me, and he and I have talked about this, and there's no substitute for what you as an operator are experiencing for giving us insights about what's happening in the community. So once again, I want to tell you how much I appreciate it, and we appreciate your participating in this. These mean a lot to us. They bring a lot to the table for us as we prepare to improve our courseware. And I'll remind you that we're always in the process of updating the courseware with this material. We've got new graphics we're always trying to integrate, and we've got a new online program we're trying to get people interested in, because we do need to pay the bills. So thank you very much, and thank you, Harry, for your assistance today. That was great.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we'll sign off. Thank each of you.